The original Commander Precon decks were released in June of 2011, with 5 decks to help new players dive into the format. These provided you with a complete 100-card singleton deck, with 3 legendary creatures in each deck who could be legal commanders to offer you some choices as to who would lead. These decks gave not only reprints of soon-to-be commander staples like Sol Ring, but introduced us to new cards that were made just for the commander format, like Command Tower. These carried an MSRP of $29.95, a price point that would never again see the light of day, and really was an indication of Wizards' uncertainty with this product. This was the first fan-made format Wizards has ever formally endorsed in such a way, and so it really was up in the air as to how this product would sell. Little did we know that this would be the start of perhaps their most successful line of products, the Commander Precon decks, which would start as an annual product only later to transition into a product running along nearly every set release. In this series, we will take a look at these historic Precon decks as they were in their original printing. We will examine the cards given their first printing in these decks, the reprints included in each deck, and some cards that could be used to upgrade the deck list out of the box that were historically used. We will explore the deck's legacy and how they hold up in today's Commander format. I hope you'll join us for this adventure. My name is Flint, and welcome to the history of the Commander Precon. The Commander 2011 decks, or at the time were just called Commander, were 3-color, wedge-themed decks. These came out a few years before the Khans of Tarkir block, and so the design of these color combinations had yet to be really fleshed out as they would be on Tarkir. It would be the first time Wizards ever explored cards made for Commander, taking into account the multiplayer aspect of the format, and how card design would impact the increased number of players. This video will take a look at specifically the Heavenly Inferno deck, a red, white, and black deck that focused on massive flying threats. The cover commander, Kalia of the Vast, cost 1, a red, a white, and a black mana. She's a 2/2 human cleric with flying. Whenever she attacks an opponent, you may put an angel, demon, or dragon creature card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking that opponent. This was an unprecedented amount of power on a 4 mana value commander at the time. All 3 of these creature types feature really large creatures, often with powerful abilities or beefy stat lines, frequently both. Kalia allowed you to bypass so many limitations on them by simply dropping one of these creatures into play tapped and attacking. These creatures would not go away at the end of combat, and so while the deck would heavily depend on her being in play to cheat the big creatures out, it could do so with relative ease. There was an element of surprise in not knowing what a Kalia player might be holding up, and given that you did not need to pay for the creature card, a Kalia player could be tapped out and still utilize her ability. We would see the deck find some lethal threats, including a one-shot kill card that could break its own rules through Kalia. She too has flying, giving her effective evasion that could be problematic for some players to deal with. Throwing a small amount of protection on her in the form of something like Lightning Greaves would render her almost untouchable in some matchups. Our first backup commander is Tariel, Reckoner of Souls, who costs 4 and then 1 each of red, white, and black. Tariel is a 4/7 angel with both flying and vigilance. It has the activated ability to tap to return a creature card from a target opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. This card goes in a much different direction than Kalia, and opts for a slower, more grindy game, making it so opponents have to be mindful of what creatures they allow go to their graveyard. I feel like Tariel would, in most cases, be operating independently of what the rest of the deck would be doing, as the 99 could focus on resource denial and killing off creatures that Tariel can then bring back. I feel like Tariel still carries a lot of the older design space legendary creatures had, where a splashy ability is tacked onto a very clunky body. 7 mana is no laughing matter, let alone in a deck that has no access to effective ramp at this time. It's likely this card would only ever be cast once in a game, as after the first time it'd be sent packing to the command zone, it would then cost 9 mana to recast, making it very difficult to regain that tempo. Our second backup commander is actually part of a cycle that these first Precon decks utilized, the Planar Chaos Dragons. In this deck, we got Oros the Avenger, a 6/6 dragon with flying for 3, a white, a black, and a red. Whenever Oros deals combat damage to a player, you may pay 2 and 1 white, and if you do, Oros deals 3 damage to each non-white creature. I will say, I really like Oros, but largely in its own commander deck. There are a lot of unique and fun ways to make the most of this card, looking at cards like Darkest Hour to ensure every creature gets hit by Oros' ability. You can also take advantage of that board wipe ability by granting it lifelink, and allowing our life total to skyrocket as that ability resolves. That being said, I do still feel that this card would be better not as the commander of this deck out of the box, but as a standalone deck. So in this deck, including our 2 new commanders, we got a total of 15 new cards printed to Magic just for this format. Even though we are still very new to this family of card design, we did get some new cards that were a bit better than the rest. I will only ever get to realistically talk about this card as a new card as we discuss this specific cycle of commander precons, but Command Tower really was a game changer for commander deck building. You'll see as we progress, but in Commander, the mana bases of these decks are perhaps the most critical part of your brewing process, and certain qualities are more valued over others. There are dozens of cycles of dual lands that we have to fall upon for mana fixing, and not all lands are created equally. Command Tower offers us a non-basic land that enters untapped, and it produces 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. This was huge. It was unsearchable by fetch lands in most land ramp, but it would offer you the perfect first turn land drop that was relevant at any point during the game. It would give you 1 mana of any color that you would need anyway, and I can't think of a scenario in this period of Commander that I would not want this level of color fixing. As we can see, even years later, this card sees play in nearly every single Commander deck, the only exceptions largely being monocolored decks, or decks that specifically want basic lands. Avatar of Slaughter is an 8-mana 8/8 avatar, and it grants all creatures double strike and a requirement that they attack each combat if able. This card goes all in on aggro, forcing all players to attack and then giving every creature double strike. It does cost 8 to cast, which is costly even back then, and it being an avatar does not open it up to Kalia's shenanigans, but it's an ability that gives such a tremendous presence to the table it can really help speedrun games. Soul Snare is 1 white mana for an enchantment. You can pay 1 white and sacrifice the Soul Snare to exile a target creature that's attacking you or a Planeswalker you control. This card was a fantastic piece of spot removal. See, it does telegraph your intent and it can be a deterrent for attacks. An opponent will see this sitting in play and they have to consider their options of swinging their best creature at you, for fear that it might be exiled in response. At this point in time, Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile were both expensive cards, even though Path to Exile was in this deck, making them relatively inaccessible to most players, and so this was a budget-friendly option that gave you accessibility. Stranglehold is a 4-mana enchantment with 2 abilities. Your opponents can't search libraries, and if an opponent would start an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. This was one of the few red stacks pieces that we would see, turning off fetch lands and tutors, pod effects, and anything that would cast an extra turn. This was a pretty solid card in this deck, as Kalia didn't do too much searching to have to worry. We also got quite a few good reprints in this deck, especially given the time of printing. Some of these cards hadn't gotten a reprint in quite a while, if at all, and some valuable Commander staples had found their way into this deck, so players wanting to get into the format had a running start. Again, I only get to discuss these cards as reprints once really, but Sol Ring is so ubiquitous to the format, it's easy to overlook just how strong it really is. A 1-mana artifact that can tap every turn, including the turn it's played, for 2 colorless mana can ramp you exponentially over the course of a game. This deck alone has a pretty high curve, and so while you might not always be able to cheat all creatures into play using Kalia's ability, you can simply hardcast them. Sol Ring can really easily help out with the generic costs of cards, and it's this level of generic power that has seen this card be reprinted in literally every Commander deck since its printing. At the time, this card hadn't seen a proper reprinting since Revised. You got a few promo printings like from the Vault, but that's it. So it got a little expensive due to its scarcity, but after the Commander decks gave it a forever home, it became a lot more accessible. Anger is a great haste enabler because it goes live in the graveyard and it's easy to get this card into the bin. As long as you control a mountain, which shouldn't be too difficult, all creatures you control have haste. Fallen Angel is one of my favorite sack outlets, giving us a free repeatable sack outlet on a flying body. This can be a great combat trick, swinging in with your creatures, and should any of them be blocked, you can sacrifice them to the Fallen Angel to give her buffs and increase the damage that she will deal. Mother of Runes is an all-star in Voltron decks, which were a lot more common back in those days. Even Kalia can function in some ways as a Voltron build, and the Mother will offer her protection from whatever color you need to avoid. Akroma's Vengeance is a board wipe that clears off artifacts, creatures, and enchantments, making it very wide-reaching. If you don't need it at the moment, or if the 6 mana cost is unattainable given the board state, you can pay 3 mana to cycle it and draw you a card. At this point in the format, board wipes were a lot different than what they are today. We didn't get Cyclonic Rift until the following year, and both Damnation and Wrath of God were pretty expensive, and so you'd have to fall onto alternate board wipe. Darksteel Ingot is a 3-mana rock with Indestructible. This might seem rather simple, but this is one of the go-to mana rocks for the time. Having an indestructible mana rock means that this could survive wrath effects like the Akroma's Vengeance. This of course would eventually see less and less play as 2 mana rocks became more powerful and dominant, but it still deserves respect for its legacy. Lightning Greaves is a 2-drop equipment artifact that equips for 0 and gives the equipped creature both haste and shroud. This is one of the most widely used equipments in both Voltron and non-Voltron decks. Giving it Shroud and Haste is tremendous, and if we need any indication of its power, we need look no further than our commander. Kaalia is a 4-drop, meaning that we can drop the Greaves into play before we drop Kaalia, and then upon Kaalia entering the battlefield, we equip her with the Greaves and she can attack right away. This also protects her from any interaction that would target, and so this could protect her from removal as we begin dropping our giant creatures into play. This still sees play today, and still commands a respectable penny despite it having several reprints. Path to Exile is a 1-drop removal spell. Instant speed removal was not yet at the point it is at today, and so this being 1 mana with only a minor downside made it one of the best removal spells White had. Some commander decks don't run many basics, and so there were times where this would fail to find a basic land, meaning that we got away with removing an opponent's creature with no compensation on their end. Return to Dust is a 4-drop instant that exiles an artifact or enchantment, but has an additional upside if you cast it during your main phase, letting you exile a second artifact or enchantment. This is a very powerful variation of the naturalize ability in White, letting you remove up to 2 problem permanents. It still offers you the flexibility of using it on your opponent's turn, but gives extra benefit to holding it up until yours. Siphon Mind is a personal favorite of mine, a 4-drop sorcery that rips a card from each opponent's hand and then lets you draw a card for each card discarded this way. Commander is a multiplayer format, so a card that in traditional 1v1 Magic might only draw you 1 card scales quite nicely when there might be 3 or more components at the table. Paying 4 to have the opponents discard a card each and then drawing you at least 3 cards is quite a good swing and advantage, especially at this point in time when graveyard recursion was rather limited. Now, given that this deck has been out for well over a decade, we've had literal years of thought, time, and effort put into this deck. Kaalia was for a very long time one of the most popular commanders, making for a lot of unique tech and spice. A lot of decks look to focus on one specific creature type, though you could maintain a balance of all 3 and use the best of each type. I might be a monster for looking at it this way, but I do personally enjoy using a little bit of stacks in my Kaalia list, leaning into cards like Drana and Linvala to shut down my opponent's ability to counteract my moves. Shilgengar, a more recent release, has a unique form of reanimation that scales should you be using angels in your list, and can make for a bit fun flavor. Perhaps the most notorious card to ever be slotted into a Kaalia deck is Master of Cruelties, a 5-mana demon from Gatecrash. This creature is a 1/4, has First Strike and Death Touch, and it can only attack alone. Whenever the Master of Cruelties attacks a player and isn't blocked, that player's life total then becomes 1, and the Master of Cruelties assigns no combat damage this combat. This might look like a Nombo at first, given its attack restrictions. However, this only means that the Master of Cruelties is the only creature being declared an attacker during the declare attacker's part of the combat phase. If Kaalia is declared an attacker and puts the Master of Cruelties onto the battlefield tapped and attacking, we have bypassed that part of combat and it circumvents this restriction. Now from there, the Master of Cruelties also has First Strike, and so if it isn't blocked, before anything else connects, the defending player's life total becomes 1. Kaalia will be attacking that player as well, and so after the Master makes the defending player's life total 1, Kaalia's combat will connect, dealing 2 damage and taking that opponent out of the game. Now, of course, this can only be really done once, since the Master of Cruelties is now in play, can't be cheated out again, or attack with a friend, unless you do some bounce shenanigans. But that being said, this is one of the most powerful and degenerate combos this deck has. Now, since Kaalia has been released, we've seen dozens of powerful angels, demons, and dragons come and go, and so there are so many options that you can include in your personal list. Archfiend of Depravity, Balefire Dragon, Razaketh the Foul-Blooded, Sower of Discord, the list goes on and on and on. You really have your pick of the litter here, and I think that's what makes building a Kaalia deck such a fun and unique experience. Nowadays, I do still feel like Kaalia sees a decent level of popularity, largely due to how popular the 3 creature types she supports are, and we do get new cards to consider for her deck with most set releases. The Heavenly Inferno Precon deck has become one of the most expensive Precon decks to buy today, though you could theoretically buy the singles from the deck for a fraction of the price, Kaalia herself recently getting a reprint in the Modern Horizons 3 set. Despite her being a powerhouse in her heyday, we have seen her move somewhat out of the spotlight with the release of more pushed legends with either combo enablers or value engines that are on the command zone, power creeping her out of the format. But with that, we will bring to an end our look at the Heavenly Inferno Precon deck. Did you get this deck back in the day? Do you play with any of the legendary creatures from this deck nowadays? I had a friend in college who actually built a very strong Kaalia deck, and he was one of the toughest opponents to beat. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if so, likes and shares are among the best ways to help support the channel. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a future video. And as always, I appreciate you hanging out with me here today. My name is Flynn, and I'll see you all in the next video.